Welcome to Innisfil Accelerates, a podcast about the people and technology transforming one Ontario town. Today, we're talking about the city of the future. Planned cities have been around for a long time. Washington, D.C. was designed to be the capital of a newly independent United States. The city was built into 4 grids, each of which intersected right at the center of the Capitol building, the People's House. The design itself was intended to be a physical manifestation of democratic ideals. In the centuries that followed, many other planned cities were constructed, some more successfully than others. In the 1950s, Brazilians built a new national capital. An enormous monument to modernist architecture, Brasilia was intended to avoid the overpopulation and poverty of Rio de Janeiro. 70 years later, Brasilia is one of the largest planned cities in the world. But most of the residents don't live inside the spacious, planned interior of the city. Most of its 4.2 million residents are crammed into 20 unplanned satellite communities on its outskirts. Brasilia, the planned city of the future, has descended into an overcrowded dystopia. But other countries are still planning other cities of the future. Saudi Arabia is constructing an enormous smart city in the northwestern corner of the country.
It's set to be a futuristic megacity complete with robots, flying taxis, and even an artificial moon. The new Jetsons-like city is all about smart technology while promising neighborhoods with zero carbon emissions.
Called NEOM, the country has pledged $500 billion towards its construction. It's all an attempt to course-correct an economy that is almost entirely dependent on oil towards a more diversified future with industries like shipping, biotech, and information technology. But Saudi Arabia is a country controlled by a single family, an authoritarian regime that is taking cues from China in its design of NEOM, where every citizen is tracked and privacy will be an impossibility. Closer to home, a raft of billionaires have plans for their own future cities. Elon Musk has announced his plan to build a new city in Texas he's calling Starbase. It'll be a place for workers of his company SpaceX to work on their next-generation rocket program.
1, ignition. We have liftoff.
But he's not the only billionaire with plans for the city of the future. The head of Walmart's e-commerce division, Mark Lowry, recently resigned. He plans to spend the rest of his career building the city of the future, one that will be supported by a new vision of capitalism. So who gets to build the city of the future? Are such enormous projects only going to be possible for autocratic governments or freewheeling billionaires? Those questions are ones that Noah Redler wrestles with on a daily basis. The founder of the Smart City Experience, Noah works with municipalities, community organizations, and businesses to envision a different kind of smart city, one that is far more responsive to and designed for regular people.
Well, I think what's exciting right now is the definition of that is actually changing. If we talked about a smart city even 5-10 years ago, we were really talking about the theoretical approach, things that only could be developed by giant companies, whether it be IBM or Google. Many people have heard about the Sidewalk Labs project in the Toronto Shore area, which sadly didn't work. But we've seen that well before the entire question of smart cities was about technological capacity, about building infrastructure, about capturing data and facilitating to a certain degree decision-making. It's moving a lot forward to really thinking about how cities can evolve to use either technological or non-technological innovations to make the city flow better. And when I think about what a smart city is, it really is about a place where we take the fundamentals of a city, we enable our ability to collect a lot of data to help us make better decisions and decide where we're investing in the city in terms of the citizens' experience. And now we have to add another layer thinking about how are we going to improve the user experience? Because to a certain degree, what we're trying to do with cities is bring a new business model to them, bring a startup model to them. And that requires a different type of thinking and a different type of planning, but it doesn't actually change the fundamentals of what a city is that we need to get from A to B, we need to congregate together, we need transport, we need water coming out of our pipes, we need our trash collected. a smart city is about making those processes simpler, about facilitating them and increasing the interaction between the public officials and the citizens themselves.
And just to put a finer point on just how topical this is, just as we record this morning, Mark Lohr, who is the now former chief of Walmart's e-commerce unit, is leaving. He's going to start designing a new smart city, is what he says. And it's quite the pitch. He says he wants to combine like the culture and dynamism of a New York with the social safety net of a Sweden. And so too, we also heard MBS, the somewhat nefarious leader of Saudi Arabia, with a wild plan to create a small, skinny city across the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula. I'm sure you've heard these, but what do you make of these really top-down approaches, be it like from a nation-state perspective or from a billionaire perspective? Is this the right way to go about this in your view?
That's a great question, actually. And unlike many other things, it actually has to be one of those approaches that has to come from both directions. You need that top-down because, like it or not, a smart city is a very technical, complex institution that requires technical standards, that requires legislation to be brought about to allow for these new ways of operating to be acceptable. And also we have to create norms and standards so that technology providers can say, oh, all right, if I want to create a solution for this city, well, all I have to do is follow these standards, follow these rules, follow these security protocols, and I could fit into the central system of the city if I follow these rules. That will enable innovation. That will allow for people to participate in a smart city. And it'll also give cues for where the industry needs to go to create solutions. But at the same time, there has to be a citizen movement that is bringing together the social aspects of what a smart city needs to consider. Because as much as there are large overarching questions and infrastructure questions that need to be put forward to make a smart city operate, we can never forget the social element and the human element of it. And we as people need to be a part of the consideration. The earliest concrete example is participatory budgets. A lot of cities allow citizens to participate in 20% of their city budget and decide how it's getting spent. Well, we're deciding how we're going to change the quality of life for ourselves. We're going to decide how we're going to create new systems. And like in any good innovation process, involving the end user, in this case, the citizens in this process, ensures that we leave nobody behind and we really take the time to consider all the considerations that need to go into it. One of the key examples that a good friend of mine from an organization here in Montreal called Itinéraire always talks about is, Luc Desjardins, the director of the organization, he brings up the example of, well, I love the idea of autonomous buses. I think it'll add a lot of efficiency, more predictable. But I have a lot of homeless people who don't have a bus pass, can't afford bus tickets sometimes. And sometimes they need to take a bus and they can step on that bus and the driver can make a human decision of, all right, I'm going to be a decent person today and I'm just going to drop them off a few blocks down. And this is something that gets done in the social contract of people living together. The minute you put a robot in its place, well, then there's no question. There's no emotional decision being made. There's no determination of if this person needs help. Do you have the electronic ticket to get on or do you not? That is the only decision-making process that can happen. So we need to fill these considerations into the question because we don't want to create a new divide in cities where we used to talk about a social economic divide. Now we could create a new digital divide and it could be just as dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's interesting. So much of how our cities are organized now are, 19th or 20th century technologies, and they really are kind of technologies, aren't they? But just as, Moore's law has sped everything up, the technology has wildly outpaced those kind of legacy systems inside the cities. And I just think about like how inefficient communication is from the city to you, how you pay your taxes, how you access other kinds of services. Is this space the most ripe for disruption or change or utilizing that kind of startup model, do you think?
I think it's one of the places that needs the most change, but is also going to be the exact place where change takes the most amount of time. And cities, you said exactly, cities have been innovating for a long time. They, water pipes under the city, having electricity in your house, these are technologies, these are innovations. We have reinvented cities time and time again throughout history. And now we're in the process of doing it again. But cities are still very human organizations. If you are starting to talk about changing operational processes, well, an entire group of very likely unionized employees are going to have to adopt this solution, be trained in it. the cost of this transformation is massive. And the way cities are set up right now, it's very siloed, and the entire organizational structure has to change for it to be efficient. Even in the way that data shares, I won't talk about any cities in specifics, but you hear anecdotes of different departments, being keeping all their data and all their information localized with them and not sharing it with other departments in the city. Not necessarily out of a desire not to cooperate, but really in a sense that they want to protect their work. They realize that the more hands get on it, the more it could be interpreted. And there's a whole lot of legal, political, and social reasons that this happens. So that's why we talk a lot more about the human element now, because we need to bring people into the mentality of how these cities will operate in the future. And, it seems very simple to say, hey, let's just pay our taxes online. But even, if we take Ontario, if we take Quebec, it sounds like a high number, but we've only reached 80. In Quebec, we're only at 89% to digital reach. And Ontario, I think, is slightly higher at 93 or something like that. I'll have to check the last stats. But at the end of the day, that's still 7% of the population that can't pay their taxes online. And sure, we can leave a loophole for them, but pretty good chance that these people are separated in remote areas. And so where's the go-between here? And, how do we make actions to bring these people up to speed with how it is? And so age is an issue. The ability to have internet at home, a lot of us take it for granted, but we know very well in poverty centers in major cities, some people still don't have internet home access, cell phone access. These things contribute to being able to access these improved services. It's a bigger consideration, like we were talking about.
Well, yeah, it is. And, you think about trying to change existing, megacities like Toronto or New York. This is a huge task to try and undertake. And perhaps when we look at why we're having this conversation and the plan with the orbit and Innisfil's kind of more future forward look ahead, because it's a smaller jurisdiction, because it's a lot of farmland, for example, that there's a lot of more potential to build from the ground up there than trying to kind of superimpose this into a really huge existing metropolis. It seems like there's more flexibility for a smaller jurisdiction like Innisfil to try and pursue a project like the orbit. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think you're 100% right with that. I think smaller territories, and even if we're talking about large cities, you have to do it district by district or neighborhood by neighborhood. But there is no question that the ability to build from the ground up is 100% more advantageous than having to retrofit a city that already exists, especially a metropolis where a few million people are using it every single day. Well, that means you have to retrofit it around their feet. And right now I live in Montreal, and we've got major construction problems planned until 2040. It's not as much fun as it is to be in the city. The ability to build it up from the ground up is interesting, but it brings its own challenges because you're creating something that didn't exist before. And so you have to imagine what the users of the city are going to want, who they're going to be. And so when there's a city that exists, we can make our decisions based on data that we have. When we're building a city from scratch, we have to interpret it in an uncertain future. And you brought up the project in Saudi Arabia, and it's actually the second project that they've been building as a city from the ground up. The other was the King Abdullah Financial District. And a few years ago, I had the rare opportunity to sit down with 3 members of the president and 2 members of the planning committee who were in Montreal for the New Cities Summit. And they would talk to me. It's like, look, it's not hard for me to build a city for tomorrow. I know everything I need tomorrow. But if I'm going to spend $500 billion over the next 5 years, well, I need to build a city for the next 100 years. And how do I make those determinations? How do I plan for technologies that don't exist yet? You mentioned Moore's Law, and we're coming to the apex of it, but now we're going to double down in Moore's Law, where we found new ways to reduce transistor sizes, and we're running towards the era of perpetual innovation. So when you have a major breakthrough happening every single week, how do you fit that into a city that you're building, that you're thinking about today? And a lot of that is going back to thinking about it a little bit like we would build an app for a growing market. We use this expression in technology development, especially for apps, building a full stack or scaling in the long term. And that's just the ability to plan ahead for, the Orbit project. We learned about it during Smart City Experience this year. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating project. And the question I think that's important behind it is, how are we going to build a city that will allow itself to evolve year after year? And so in 20 years, we don't have to rebuild it again. And when we're thinking about the territory that we're starting with, if the orbit is a success, we can assume there will be a circular ripple effect of expansion, larger and larger and larger. And so are we thinking about the systems, like when Montreal evolved into a metropolis in the early 1900s, they literally had to connect wooden pipes to iron pipes. And then today they're connecting those same pipes with plastic pipes. And right now we're going through a whole rebuild, but that's another story. But nobody would have thought about that back in the days. Like nobody, when they were putting in wooden sewers, had a concept that one day would be PVC and, we would have to attach it to that. That consideration, I think, is necessary. Yes, you have to think about the experience. Yes, you have to think about how you want to create the smart city, but how are you going to allow it to evolve? Because more important than the technology evolving, society evolves to meet that technology. And so the city has to be able to adapt to that in all times. And that's what's fun about thinking about it now.
Yeah. And, it's difficult to try and boil down like some key features of what a smart city should be. But it seems to me some of them are increased density, a move away from cars, and kind of ubiquitous connectivity seem to be kind of like the three big sort of pillars. If we take each of those in turn, why do you think those are good ideas? I think for younger generations, it may be more obvious than for older folks, although not to be too ageist about it, but nevertheless, when you talk to people about getting away from cars, like especially the baby boomers, their eyes just glaze over, like they can't even conceive of a world where they're not driving, where I think for maybe younger people, it's more obvious. But in any case, what are your thoughts about those ideas?
So increased density is something that I think I'm in the minority in this, but I think that's not where smart cities are going to go. In fact, especially in the current context with the pandemic pushing people out of major cities. But the beauty of smart cities is that what we're seeing right now is that they allow you to act as if you're in a major city. And so I think there will be a lot more of a sprawl outside, and smaller communities that you would consider in the regions or suburbs of cities will start becoming smart into themselves. And so we'll be building a lot more. I think density will not be the major issue. I don't think density will be the major issue. I think people will spread out more and will be working more remotely and connect as needed. The part about cars, I think that just makes sense, to be honest. I've given up a car for a few years now, not because I don't like driving, not because I don't see the utility. It is 100% about parking. Mm-hmm. There's nowhere to park anymore. And again, we have a city that was not built for the number of cars that are going to be using it right now. And the neighborhood where I live was probably built in a time where they couldn't even imagine one car per household, never mind 2 to 3 cars per household. And, we live with that. And so I do circles. If I ever have to rent a car or drive to see a client out of town, I rent it the night before. I do circles trying to find the place because, there's nothing else. And it just doesn't make sense. So you always have to consider car ownership in the design of your city, whether it be subterranean parking lots or street, whatever. And especially in Canada, where we're dealing with snow removal, it just doesn't really work out that well. And we're getting to a point where it's not as necessary. And so people are talking about concepts like the 15-minute city. I read the other day the 1-minute city, which I think is getting a little bit exaggerated. If you can't walk 10 minutes, then, there's other issues. But, it's about proximity, and it really is. And this is connected very much to the air quality and the environmental conditions in the city, and also the mobility of all different types of citizens, not just people, I'm talking about people who are different age groups, but also people who move around in wheelchairs or have reduced mobility. Taking cars off the road can simplify their life as well. So it becomes more inclusive. But we don't really need cars anymore. So I think it's a good thing. And I think, just from a health perspective, people should get into the habit of walking 10 minutes to go get their groceries. It wouldn't be the end of the world. So I would say more from a personal level, I'm all about that. And about connectivity, it's essential. We are in an interconnected world. Again, looking at the pandemic, we're not like here in Montreal, we can't leave our house, but I absolutely don't need to. I am connected to everything I could possibly imagine, and it will be delivered to my house within the next hour, 24 hours, or whatever I need. There's something about that has allowed us to continue as a society. Imagine it like I guess you're at home right now, and so I imagine that how simple it was to set up a podcast studio and a workstation in your house with literally no friction whatsoever. And for a reasonable price that wasn't like out of this world.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are connected to everything, and this trend is going to expand. And the more that cities become smart, the more we'll need to be connected to interface with that city. But there's a major question that I think is essential, and this goes back to creating norms and standards, is the question of interoperability between cities. It's not as big a deal if we go from Innisfil to a city in Europe. If your systems don't connect, not the end of the world. But if you drive to Toronto and you need a completely different interface to interact with Toronto, that could be a bit more of an issue in terms of the human experience. So we need to think about provincial standards and national standards. And we're lucky enough in Canada that this conversation is happening and being not only promoted, but being invested in by all levels of government.
Yeah, I just had a shudder thinking about, say, Innisfil in Barrie being like the equivalent of like Microsoft and Google or something. the two nary shall meet. And speaking to that, you mentioned Sidewalk Labs and that project that, as you said, failed in Toronto, which was this idea to kind of convert a part of the lakeshore into this kind of smart city with Google taking the lead. There was a lot of pushback because of that kind of what some feared as a sort of corporatist ideology that was going to replace a more democratic ideology. Not an unimportant concern, it seems to me. What are your thoughts about that, about corporations taking the lead on this as opposed to municipal or provincial jurisdictions taking the lead?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we all have to realize that no matter what the situation comes, it will be a mix of the two. Mm-hmm. No city is going to set up their own cloud servers, and like no city is going to be starting to develop their own algorithms internally. There's a supplier process for that, and the governments will always work with the private industry to provide everything from technology to toilet paper. It's not going to be done internally. So to a certain degree, we have to understand that this marriage needs to coexist. But where Sidewalk Labs, from my reading of it, I don't have more details, but from what I've read, it broke down, is that they forgot to have all those conversations before they started the project. Hey, super cool press release, Google is coming, everything sounded amazing. And like, I was excited. I didn't know much about it, but I was excited to see what it was going to be. But then you see the little problems come up: revenue sharing, data sharing, who owns what if are you creating a false monopoly where you're stopping any other technology provider from entering the market? Even a small startup who wants to create a smart city solution, do they go through the city now or do they go through a Google? And I personally think that Google really was doing this as a big scientific experiment. I think they went into it with the right idea and with good intentions, but there is a political reality, and nobody really thought about all these underlying questions that need to be thought of in advance. And what really broke down is not the smart city idea, but the collaboration broke down because we got to a very human impasse.
Yeah, that buy-in from the public is so important. And as you say, it kind of started with a press release and this big plan, and a lot of people, the neighbors were like, what? they were kind of left not having that input, and you're just necessarily going to have pushback when that's the case. And I wonder if there's a lesson there as we look at Innisfil and that project there. What advice would you give them to try and avoid some of those stumbling blocks?
Well, one of the things I always say in any innovation or technology project is most people, when they start an innovation project, they're too eager to start prototyping and building and really seeing something tangible in front of them. I am very much of the school 75% planning, 25% work. And especially in smart cities, these are very large, complex systems that need a lot of entry points, need to think about an API strategy, a data collection strategy. All of these things have to be built into it. It is a massive thought process. And also just the operations of the city, which, I'm not talking about Innisfil but all cities I've ever seen. There's something that needs to be done where the city reworks its cohesive model so that it fits into the smart city model. And it isn't that different, but it requires a change. So take the time to really get everybody's feedback, talk to potential citizens. I know in a project like the Orbit where, the city doesn't exist, so the citizens don't exist, it's hard to do. But, think about what your ideal profile citizen is and find people find people that fit that profile and go a wide enough scope. What would you hope for? What would you want to see in a smart city? What do you like? One of the activities we do with our clients sometimes is we ask them to imagine their city in the year 2050 and we assume that these technologies are realized and implemented, what is the experience of a standard family going through their daily life? And start thinking about it that way and just, bring all the ideas together and plan it out. The second thing is really about the idea of don't over-centralize the model. People always kind of laugh when I use this example, but I really do like the WordPress model. Because what WordPress did is that they created this central brain, which is based around a blog or a microsite. And in order to turn it into any kind of website imaginable, they developed an API system where you connect all these different functionalities developed by independent developers, some developed by WordPress themselves, and it becomes a marketplace unto itself. But the beauty of it is that functionality gets created and that you can either integrate or remove it from your website relatively easy. A city needs to be thought about very much in the same way. You need a central brain and you need to be able to plug and unplug the different pieces as needed. The brains where you'll have your servers, where you'll stock your data, where you'll have the rules, where you'll have your security. But if I want to provide a snow removal app, if I want to provide an app for renting tennis courts or soccer fields, all these things need to be thought about in the sense that tennis and soccer might be popular today, but maybe in 10 years it's baseball. So I need to pull that out to be able to adapt it in some way and put in the baseball app in 10 years without having to rebuild my whole system. And so that flexibility over the long term, I think, should be put into every single smart city mentality. I asked somebody just a few days ago, what's one thing you would want to see in a smart city? And his answer was perfect and simple. It's like, I would like to be able to take a photo of a pothole on my street, send it off, upload to app, and somebody comes and repairs it without me having to think about it. And so the example you gave in BC is absolutely perfect because the missing piece of it all is there has to be follow-up. People are ready to engage in their city. They want it to be a participatory government. We want to be involved. I worked in municipal politics for about 3 years, and I absolutely love it because you really do get close to the citizen. You really get to see things change in a concrete way. But I also know that nothing irritates citizens more than listening to them for 5 minutes and then doing nothing. If we want a participatory city, if we want a participatory government, we have to ask people. We need to give them a simple way, virtually or in person, to participate in the conversation. And then there absolutely has to be action and follow-up. Otherwise, we get disenfranchised with it very, very quickly. And we're just like, all right, well, it's cool that it exists, but it doesn't speak to me. I'm a person who kind of lives on that very thin line between loving and hating government, but I also know that
as most of us do.
But I also having worked in it for a while, I also realized that it isn't the big bad monster that everybody thinks. And I was reminded time and time again, and I always remind myself, is that we live in a participatory government. Participation is essential. There's nothing that stops you from going to a city council meeting. There's nothing that stops you from getting involved. It does require time. It does require effort. There's no magic switch. Things don't happen fast, and for very good reason. Everybody has to. There has to be a consensus of some kind. People don't want to do it because one, I think it's not transparent enough, the mechanisms to interact, and two, people just don't feel like their efforts lead to anything. And so, if we want to improve that, if we want to make a true participatory system, which I think everyone is yearning for, we have to go back to really breaking down the barriers between elected officials and citizens and say, look, I'm going to hear you. I may not say yes, but if I do say yes, you will see action. And if I say no, you'll know why. And, not talking about any names specifically, transparency and frank talk, I think, is so desired right now that even if we see a fake version of it, it becomes appealing. And the real thing is very possible. And I think that smart cities especially allow us to provide the mechanisms for that kind of transparency. And that's what we should strive for.
It's a great place to leave it, Noah. Is there any final thoughts or anything you'd want to hit on before I let you go?
Just say that anybody interested in getting involved in smart cities or thinking about a project, start small, really thinking about how you want to create an experience and think about it as an evolving process over time. Don't get overwhelmed with having to integrate all the 5G and all these magical technologies. Just think about how you can be innovative and improve the quality of life of your citizens one neighborhood at a time. And you can do some really great things. The tools are available to you and lots of great organizations out there that can help you out. Just to name a few, Open North to help you with data solutions, the Canadian Climate Reality to help you with sustainability problems. Evergreen has a lot of projects. And there's funding portals on the provincial, municipal, and federal levels. Check it out.
That's great, Noah. Thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Danny. Great talking with you.
Innisfil Accelerates is a podcast sponsored by the City of Innisfil. To learn more about how they're planning for the city of the future, go to innisfilaccelerates.ca.